So imagine you're waiting like 8 months for a single event to happen right in the middle of your living room.
Oh, wow. 8 months.
Yeah, 8 entire months. You've prepared everything. You have the perfect lighting, the perfect environment, the perfect subjects just sitting there.
Right.
You sit down, you watch, and absolutely nothing happens.
Yeah, that sounds incredibly frustrating.
Right. And day after day, week after week, just nothing. But today, we are opening up the journal of someone who endured exactly that kind of waiting game. And in the process, they accidentally unlocked like this absolute masterclass in how we observe the world around us.
It really is, it's a fascinating exercise in what we do with our attention when our expectations are just completely denied.
Yeah.
Because we're looking at a scenario where most people would just, walk away.
Yeah.
But this person decides to lean in closer.
Exactly. So, welcome to the deep dive. We are exploring a single, highly specific source today, which is a personal journal entry from a really dedicated aquarist named Ang.
Right.
And this was published on August 16th, 2026. It's titled Notes on Fishkeeping, Part 319.
Part 319, that's a lot of notes.
It's a ton of notes. And our mission today is to kind of pull the insights out of this seemingly simple note about a home fish tank. Because, reading through this, you realize it is not really just an update about a pet.
No, not at all.
It's this incredibly detailed study and observation, the mechanics of patience, and, well, how to decode nonverbal behavior when the subject you're watching literally cannot speak to you.
Right, because the setting is a home aquarium, but the methodology being applied here is, it's really rigorous.
Yeah, it is.
It challenges you to think about how you handle stagnation in your own life. Like, do you get frustrated and quit, or do you, start taking better notes?
Okay, let's unpack this, because we really need to get into the actual situation Ang is documenting here.
Let's do it.
So the subjects of this entry are a specific pair of fish. They are two-striped-dwarf-cichlids.
Right. The scientific name is apistogramma-bitaeniata.
Exactly. Apistogramma-bitaeniata. We have a male and a female.
Hmm.
And the core conflict driving this whole journal entry is that for the past 8 months, these two fish have been growing. They are incredibly healthy. They've had, endless opportunities to mate and spawn.
And they just refuse to breed.
They completely refuse.
Yeah, and you have to understand, 8 months in the context of an aquarium, that is an eternity.
I can imagine.
Because when you are maintaining a tank,
Right.
you are essentially playing the role of, a local deity.
Oh, that's a good way to put it.
Right. You
Yeah.
control the weather, the food supply, the water chemistry, all of it. So when you create the optimal conditions for an organism to fulfill its primary biological imperative, which is reproduction,
Right.
and it just doesn't happen, the natural human response is intense frustration. You feel like the whole system is broken.
I know I would be losing my mind. I mean, it really reminds me of trying to play matchmaker for two friends who, are absolute perfect for each other.
Oh, yeah, that is a great comparison.
You do all the heavy lifting, right? You invite them to the same dinners. You make sure there is an open seat next to them. They hang out in the same group for 8 solid months, but they will not officially go on a date.
They just won't do it.
And you are standing there looking at them thinking, the mood is right, the lighting is perfect. What is the holdup here?
Yeah, and that matchmaking analogy actually highlights the different ways we can react to that kind of frustration.
Right.
Because if your friends don't date, you might just get annoyed and stop inviting them out.
Totally. I'd give up.
Right. And on the aquarium hobby, an outcome-oriented person might drastically alter the water's pH or dump in a bunch of new chemicals, raise the temperature, or just, sell the fish and start over with a new species.
Because they just want the result.
Exactly. They want the result, and if the current variable isn't providing the result, they throw the variable out.
But the text shows us Ang doing the exact opposite of that. There is a line in the entry that I think anchors this whole deep dive for us. Ang writes, "Even so, I took the opportunity to hone my fish-keeping skills by keeping them, observing their behavior, taking notes, and making the necessary adjustments."
Yeah, that's the pivot right there.
Right. So instead of giving up on the matchmaking, Ang just pulls up a chair and turns into, a behavioral psychologist.
And that pivot is where the real work begins. Ang shifts from outcome-oriented thinking, which is, I need these cichlids to breed, to process-oriented thinking.
A process becomes the point.
Exactly. The goal becomes the observation itself. And when Ang mentions making the necessary adjustments, we have to understand the depth of what that means over an 8-month period.
Because it's not just staring at the glass, right?
No, not at all.
Mm.
That involves meticulously testing nitrate levels, tracking trace changes in water hardness, monitoring these tiny microfluctuations in their diet. The fish's stubbornness actually becomes the catalyst for Aang's own discipline.
Okay, but this brings up a big question for me. If Aang is just sitting there watching them not breed, what is there actually left to write down?
Right.
I mean, how detailed can a journal get about a fish just, swimming around a tank? Because the entry quickly pivots into what feels like a really heavy biology lesson.
It does get very technical.
Yeah. Aang starts going into the mechanical details of how these cichlids move, specifically mentioning that fish fundamentally swim in a form known as carangiform or sub-carangiform locomotion.
Yes. Those terms describe the mechanical baseline of the animal.
Okay.
Carangiform and sub-carangiform locomotion, they basically refer to the specific way these fish propel themselves through the water. They use these alternating muscle contractions that travel down the length of their body.
Wait, okay, I'm reading this section about the carangiform movement, and I genuinely don't get why it is here.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, why is an expert aquarist writing down the basic physics of how a fish swims in a personal journal? Doesn't Aang already know this?
Well, sure, of course they know it.
It just feels like a human writing in their diary. Like, today, my partner walked across the kitchen by putting one foot in front of the other, utilizing their knee joints to propel their center of mass forward. It seems totally redundant to me.
I get that. It definitely sounds redundant if you treat a journal merely as a log of new events, like just a diary of what happened today.
Right, which is how most people use journals.
Exactly. But if you look at it as a scientific instrument, recording the baseline is actually the most critical step of the entire process.
The baseline being the normal behavior.
Yes. You cannot spot a subtle behavioral anomaly unless you possess a rigid structural definition of what normal looks like. And more importantly, unless you actively force your brain to keep that definition in the foreground.
Oh, interesting. So you're saying Aang writes it down to prevent the brain from just glossing over the mundane details.
Precisely. The human brain is an incredibly efficient filter. We stop seeing the mechanics of walking, and we only pay attention if someone trips and falls.
Right. We just tune it out.
So by explicitly defining carangiform locomotion in the notes, by literally writing down the rule that alternating muscle contractions are designed to equal forward movement, Aang is consciously building the framework required to notice when that rule is violated.
Because in any observational study, you have to define the constant before you can isolate the variable.
That is exactly it.
Okay, let's break down that constant then, because understanding the mechanism seems to be the only way to really understand what Aang catches next. So how does this carangiform locomotion actually work in practice for these dwarf cichlids?
Well, it essentially relies on a wave of energy. The fish flexes muscles on one side of its body, then the other.
Right, side to side.
And this creates a wave that propagates down the spine toward the tail fin. As the tail sweeps side to side, it displaces water backward.
Okay, tracking with you.
And because of Newton's third law of motion, every action has an equal and opposite reaction. Pushing that water backward generates thrust. And that thrust is what propels the fish forward.
So the entire biological machinery of that movement is engineered for one specific purpose, which is forward propulsion.
Yes. Yeah.
So if the muscles are firing in that specific side-to-side pattern, the fish should be moving forward. That is the rule.
That is the absolute rule. The input is muscular contraction. The mandatory output is forward momentum.
Which brings us to the moment the rule gets broken. The anomaly in the tank.
Here we go.
Aang writes that the male two-striped-dwarf-cichlid was suddenly doing something strange, quote, treading the water by holding its position.
Right.
So the male fish was making all the alternating muscle contractions of carangiform movement, but it was not moving forward. It was just hovering in place, casually stationed at the side of the tank.
And biologically speaking, that is a paradox.
Really? A paradox?
Yeah, because if the tail is sweeping and generating forward thrust, the fish cannot simply remain stationary by magic. The momentum has to go somewhere.
Oh, that makes sense. It makes me think of like revving a car engine while keeping your foot slammed on the brake.
That's a good analogy.
You are burning all this energy, the mechanical system is doing the work of driving, but you are intentionally keeping the vehicle parked.
The car analogy captures the wasted energy perfectly, but the biology actually tells a slightly more complex story.
Oh, how so?
Well, a car brake just uses friction to stop the wheels. A fish doesn't have friction brakes.
Oh, right. Obviously, they're in water.
Right. To maintain a perfectly stationary position while the tail is generating forward thrust, the fish has to actively generate a counterforce.
A counterforce.
Yes, it has to use its pectoral fins, those are the fins on its sides, to push water forward at the exact same rate the tail is pushing water backward.
Wow. Wait, so it's not just hanging out. It is actively fighting its own forward momentum.
Exactly. It requires an incredible amount of biological coordination and energy to sit perfectly still while your main engine is firing.
That is wild.
It is a highly deliberate, highly active state that is basically disguised as doing nothing.
That completely changes the context of what Ang is looking at. And Ang doesn't just guess what this means. The journal notes that Ang goes to the established literature on cichlid behavior to cross-reference this specific treading motion.
Which is the right move.
Yeah. And the text outlines two possible hypotheses for what this male fish is actually doing.
Right. So the first hypothesis drawn from the literature is that the fish is simply cruising in a relaxed state, just idling in the water column, perhaps maintaining its position in a slight current.
Sort of like a person treading water.
Yeah, exactly the way a person might tread water in the deep end of a pool just to keep their head up.
Okay, but here's where it gets really interesting, the second hypothesis. The literature suggests that this stationary rhythmic treading could actually be a distinct form of courtship flirting.
Now we're talking.
Right. The male is using this highly controlled stationary vibration to entice the female.
And here's the core problem for the observer, distinguishing between those two hypotheses.
Because they look the same.
Yes. Is he just idling, or is he flirting? If you just take a snapshot of the behavior, or if you only observe the tank for, like, 5 minutes, they look physically identical.
Wow.
The mechanics of idling and the mechanics of this specific courtship display overlap almost entirely to the untrained eye.
So going back to our matchmaking analogy, if this is flirting, it is incredibly subtle.
Very subtle.
It's not the guy buying a flashy drink or yelling a joke across the room to get attention. It is the guy who just leans against the wall, perfectly still, radiating this quiet, focused energy, hoping the girl notices he is directing it entirely at her.
Exactly.
It's this micro-expression of romance. But how do you prove that is what's happening when you are looking at a fish?
Well, you can't prove it with the textbook alone. The literature provides the possibilities, right?
Yep.
But it cannot give you the definitive answer for the specific organisms in your living room.
Which is why the timeline Ang established earlier is the only reason this mystery gets solved.
The 8 months.
Yes, the 8 months. Ang concludes the entry by writing, "Based on my observations of this pair for so many moons, this is most likely the usual courtship flirting."
So many moons. That is the phrase that validates the entire 8-month wait. Ang is relying on longitudinal data.
Can you break down what that means in this specific context, longitudinal data?
Sure. It means Ang isn't just reading about apistogramma-bitaeniata as a species. Ang knows these two specific fish.
Oh, right, because of all the notes.
Exactly. Over 8 months of observing them not breeding, Ang has cataloged their normal idling behavior, their feeding behavior, their territorial disputes.
All the baselines.
All of them. By building that massive historical data set of how they normally interact, Ang can recognize the microscopic shift in energy, the specific orientation of the male toward the female, the slight change in rhythm that elevates this from just treading water to actual courtship.
So the textbook gave Ang the vocabulary, but the patience, the 8 months of just watching the tank do nothing, gave Ang the context to decode the vocabulary.
That's beautifully said, yeah. It is a profound example of synthesizing information. You have the structural knowledge of biomechanics, the courtship motion.
Right.
You have the external literature, the hypotheses of cruising versus flirting. And finally, you have the deeply personal, long-term observational data that acts as the filter to arrive at the correct deduction.
That is just incredible. So what does this all mean? We started with a frustrated hobbyist staring at a fish tank that wasn't doing what it was supposed to do, and we end up with this intricate breakdown of how to properly observe the world. What is the ultimate takeaway here for the listener? Like, how do we apply the patience of an aquarist to our own lives?
Well, I think you have to consider how we process information today. We live in a culture that demands immediate outcomes. Right?
Definitely. Everything has to be instant.
Right. If we put energy into a project, a relationship, or even learning a new skill, and we don't see forward momentum immediately, our instinct is to assume the system is broken.
We think we're doing it wrong.
Exactly. We panic when things feel stagnant. We stop paying attention and we just walk away. But this journal entry really challenges you to look at your own stagnant projects. Think about the things in your life that haven't moved forward in 8 months.
The things that just seem to be treading water.
Yes, exactly. Instead of viewing that stagnation as a failure, look at the mechanics of what is actually happening. Are you sure nothing is moving?
Yeah.
Or are you just failing to observe the opposing forces?
Because it takes energy to stay still.
Exactly. Sometimes a lack of forward motion isn't a failure to launch. It might be preparation. It might be the gathering of energy. It might be a highly deliberate, highly active state of equilibrium that is entirely necessary for the next phase.
It might be the incredibly subtle courtship flirt of your next big breakthrough, and you just haven't been watching closely enough to realize it's happening.
Which leads to a final thought I really want you to consider.
Oh, what's that?
Look at the title of the source material one more time. This was Notes on Fishkeeping, Part 319.
Part 319. Yeah, that implies a staggering amount of daily observation.
It really does. If it took a dedicated aquarist, over 300 journal entries, and 8 months of quiet waiting just to properly decode a tiny stationary movement of a single dwarf cichlid in a controlled glass box,
Right.
what subtle rhythms of communication are happening right in front of you right now, in your home, in your workplace, in your closest relationships? What incredibly important signals are going completely unnoticed simply because you haven't sat still long enough to establish the baseline?